Welcome everyone to our meeting of the Planning Development Committee for January 28th, 2019. I believe all members of committee are here. I remind everyone that today's meeting to please ensure all cell phones and other electronic devices are turned off. Councillor members are reminded to please refrain from sending texts and emails during the meeting. Approval of agenda. Members of committee, there are a few agenda items identified on the package in front of you. I will ask the City Clerk to review the changes for today's agenda since its publication.
Thank you, Chair Medeiros. Through you, the following item was listed on the agenda to be distributed prior to the meeting, and that's item 8.1, minutes of the Brampton Heritage Board from January the 15th, 2019, and those are on your desks. We also received, after the finalization of the agenda, one item of correspondence. That'll be item 13.1, and that's from Ryan Mino Lehan, partner, KLM Planning, dated January 28th, 2019. Item 7.3 on the agenda, that's city-initiated amendments to the Credit Valley Secondary Plan. And also you have on your desk before you an enhanced version of a map that was contained in report 7.2 as page 90. So that was already in your agenda, but this is just for better viewing of that map. And Chair Medeiros, those are the changes to today's agenda.
Thank you, City Clerk. Members of the committee, are there any additions or changes? Councillor Fortini.
Thank you, Judge. Did we just put the 8.1 into consent?
Or someone wants to speak? Huh?
We're not there yet.
Okay, Councillor Fortini, we'll take that when we get into the consent portion. So no changes to the agenda. Moved by Councillor Williams. All in favor? Carried. Declarations of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Are there any members who'd like to declare a conflict of interest? No. Now we move on to the consent agenda. The items listed with an asterisk on the agenda are considered to be routine and non-controversial. The consent motion is to adopt this matter on today's agenda without the need for a separate discussion on the item. Unless a member requests a separate discussion, does any member wish to add or remove an item from the consent motion on the agenda? I think Councillor Fortini at this time. Yes. Okay, Councillor Fortini has moved Brampton Heritage minutes into consent. Are there any further changes? No. Can I get a mover? Councillor Fortini, all in favor? Carried. Delegation item 5.1. I believe we have a presentation from D. Riley, SGL Planning and Design regarding the City of Toronto's Gore Density Policy Review. And we also have a staff-related report, item 7.1, which we can consider after the presentation. Welcome.
Hello, members of committee. My name is David Riley from SGL Planning. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. So I will be doing a brief presentation to give the committee an update on the Toronto Gore Density Policy Review, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have afterwards. Generally my presentation will go through the purpose of the study, provide a context of the area, describe the policy context in which the study is being conducted in, and then overview of the phase 1 analysis that's taking place and some of the options that are being put forward in advance of public consultation. Then we'll discuss next steps. Let me just provide an overview of, I'm sure everyone is familiar, but for anyone who may not be, the Toronto Gore Community is outlined here in red. It's bounded by, on the west side, Goreway Drive, generally on the east side, the Gore Road, except for that component at the north end, north of Countryside Drive, and Castlemore Road in the south. And then there are two extensions of the community that extend up to Mayfield Road. So generally, there's two components of this neighborhood, and the purpose is to look at the study twofold. So there's an existing estate residential area that's been around for a long time. And there's also undeveloped lands, so in the southeast quadrant, and I'll go to a map of those. So for the established existing residential community, the purpose of the study is to look at what is really those defining elements of character within the neighborhood, and are there any potential policy options that we can look at to kind of strengthen, you know, from an official plan perspective, that sense of character in the community. And for the undeveloped lands in Toronto Gore, it's to look at, are these lands suitable? Currently they're designated for more estate residential development. It was to look at these lands and say, does this make sense? Or should we consider higher urban densities similar to what's happening in the developing areas and the recently developed areas around? Here's just a zoom in of the map showing most of it is the established estate residential area, with the exception of the southeast quadrant, where you can see that lower arrow pointing to the undeveloped lands. Part of this land is designated estate residential currently in the official plan, with the exception of the southern portion of the land. So you've got the Gore Meadows Community Center north of Castlemore, but on the west side of the Gore Road and the surrounding parkland. And then you have the Gore Meadows West Park, which is, you see there's a little green area kind of separating that block between McVean and Gore Road. The west side of that little tributary there is designated for parkland, and it's city-owned lands. I've touched on this a little bit, but generally, you know, when we're going through planning studies, you start at the provincial policy level and the PPS, and the PPS has policies that promote compact development, requiring a mix of uses and dwelling types, and ensuring that we make efficient use of infrastructure. So making sure that where development is occurring, where infrastructure already exists, or where it's planned. The growth plan drills down on these policies, but in particular related to, you know, separates out built-up areas and designated greenfield areas, directs growth to settlement, and establishes minimum densities to be achieved on undeveloped lands. The Region of Peel official plan recognizes estate residential areas, including the Toronto Gore, and recognizes estate residential areas as an important part of housing in Peel region. But it limits the development of new residential, estate residential development. So it's not the intent of the region to see new areas within the rural area, for instance, become estate residential. And the City of Brampton official plan has the most detailed policies with respect to the lands, having policies for the estate residential area and the unique communities. Toronto Gore is identified as a unique community because it's of a special character, of unique attributes. It sets specific density requirements for the estate residential area, and it sets out criteria for development within the Toronto Gore, as well as for severances. And then it's important to also look at the Brampton 2040 vision, the big exercise that the city just underwent. And one of the components that the city identified was these town centers across the city. And there's a town center that is envisioned in the vicinity of Castlemore and the Gore Road, which would be on the boundary of the Toronto Gore estate residential area. Town centers are intended to support the surrounding communities, but are really meant to support a large population ultimately, as well as jobs. And so you're going to see much higher densities there. And so it's important to consider how does this affect the Toronto Gore, which is a very low density area, when you're having this you know, planned vision for a town center in the area. So town centers will impact the form and density of development in its surroundings, not just within the town center itself, which is east of the Gore Road, so outside of our study area. To start the study, we looked at the qualities of the Toronto Gore and the established estate residential community. there is a sense of open space driving through the neighborhoods. You know, there's views, there's mature landscaping lining the streets, particularly between Goreway and the Gore. If you just look at a map, you see a lot of kind of evenly placed trees along the streets. It's a rural cross-section, so you have ditches, no sidewalks. Large dwellings, you know, ranging in size from the original ones. Some have been redeveloped to large ones, but generally lots of space between the dwellings. And there's about 53 vacant lots that are scattered throughout the community. You can see here the undeveloped lands, and I've highlighted in different colors what would be considered the estate residential designated land versus the open space designated land. So you can see, I won't try to say the colors, this is always a problem, I'm colorblind, but you can see the colors where the Gore Meadows is and the surrounding parkland, and then that west park that I was referring to closer to Goreway, and then the remaining undeveloped lands. So there were really numerous components to the Phase 1 study, starting with the supply and demand analysis. So getting at the question, okay, looking at those undeveloped lands, should they be developed for estate residential going forward, or should we consider moderately higher urban densities? So a large kind of analysis of demographics occurred in the study. Within Toronto Gore, the population that lives there now is typically of older generation, so you have older persons living there. Typically, couples with children no longer living at home could indicate a desire to downsize. And there's also a forecast population growth of the 35 to 49 age cohort. And this is a cohort that has been seeking out homes within another designation in Brampton, known as the Upscale Executive Housing Area designation. You'll see that in Vales of the Humber to the north and some other areas around the city. And what the study found was that the demand, looking at the demand for estate residential housing, that demand, based on a review of current building permits, can be accommodated going forward within the existing supply of vacant lots within the built-up area. And so there was also a review of the upscale executive housing, and it was observed that the building permits, so essentially there's, in the official plan, maxes out the amount of units that can occur in an upscale executive residential area, and that's almost maxed out. And so there seems to be a growing demand for upscale executive residential housing. So one of the recommendations from the supply-demand analysis was to consider redesignating the undeveloped portion of Toronto Gore to permit moderately higher urban densities, which would be, as a first look anyway, the upscale executive residential designation, which does permit a variety of lot sizes, which would be detailed at a secondary plan in the future. There was also an important consideration to look at parkland. So if there are increased people living in this block, what does that mean for the existing amount of parkland that we have? And generally, it was concluded that there is sufficient parkland to service the existing community. At the beginning of the study, there was a question of whether the western parklands that we were looking at on the map, the viability of that. But it has determined that yes, that should be kept as a city park in line with the city's Parks Master Plan that was recently completed. Generally, for more of that, to fulfill that demand and need for passive recreation, so a place for families to have picnics, things like that. It wouldn't be programmed space in terms of sports fields. So that's the intent for that parkland there. Through a few, if there was ultimately increased urban residential densities or any development of the undeveloped lands would necessitate the need for a secondary plan on these lands, and that will further determine the parkland needs within the community. And then we also looked at transportation and infrastructure. So first, transportation. If there's all these extra units with it being built within this area, how can the surrounding roads handle that capacity? Generally, with some upgrades to the existing transportation system, looking at the whole thing on a high level, it was determined that yes, this could support moderately higher urban densities, and same for infrastructure, so sewer and water. Right now, all of the Toronto Gore estate residential area has municipal water, but everyone is on private septics. Any new development would have to be on full servicing. And so there would need to be some upgrades to some of the existing infrastructure, which of course, with any development, but those upgrades are feasible and could be accommodated, subject of course to much further detailed analysis through a secondary plan. And so we came up with some policy options for consideration of the committee and staff and the public, and policy options for the established community and policy options for the undeveloped lands. So for the established community, looking at 3 options. So the first is to identify criteria for the preservation of community character. So the official plan does recognize that there is a special character by identifying Toronto Gore as a unique community, but taking that one step further and maybe adding in criteria to the official plan that new development should have compatible built form and compatible setbacks, building orientations, separation distances. Also looking at criteria for severances. So limited, severances should be limited is the policy option being looked at, and appropriate as long as you can maintain the criteria listed above for preservation of the community character. And then there could also be an option to have specific policies to the Toronto Gore, similar to the Marysfield neighborhood, which is something that you'll hear again, some of you have already heard through previous planning committee meetings, but it's coming back in 2 weeks for an update on that study. So that's looking at part of the Toronto Gore where we're outlining specific policy recommendations and zoning recommendations. For the undeveloped lands, it's really looking at 2 options at this level. Redesignating the lands as for upscale residential, upscale executive residential designation. For your knowledge, this would at the density that's stipulated in the official plan now, which it would, if all of the lands were redesignated, it would yield about 600 additional units. For comparison, there's 600 units right now in the entire Toronto Gore. Those are 2-acre lots. Upscale executive residential is much more dense in comparison, but still large for in today's standards for urban residential development. And then the second option is similar, but looking at designating that little pocket off of the Gore Road in the east to permit even higher urban residential density, so low and medium residential, really to play off of that town center that's envisioned for across the street, and to kind of promote that development and also a transition from that high density to the very low density estate residential area. In the next phase of the study, it will be important to consider putting together recommendations that there needs to be a transition, there needs to be a recognition of the estate residential community and how that transitions to if there were more urban densities proposed. It's important to have that consideration, particularly along that northern boundary there where you see there's that direct interface between the two. So public consultation, hopefully in the first quarter of 2019, you'll see, I think we have a tentative date scheduled for sometime in March, I believe. And then develop specific policy options, followed by a final report, and then coming back here for a statutory public meeting, and then off to council with recommendations. So I'm happy to answer any questions, should there be any.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fortini.
Thank you. Through the chair, just a couple of questions. When you mean about the 600 units, you mean it's still going to be a 2-acre lots?
They would not be 2-acre. 600 units would be, I believe it's a density of 14.5 units per hectare, which is in line with the upscale executive residential designation policies. If they were to develop at 2-acre lots, they would still need to be, the recommendation would be to maintain the estate residential designation. So these would be more urban lots, but the large singles, so 40, 50, 60 foot singles would be typical within a upscale executive residential designation.
And that's where that small little pocket is. Is that what you're saying?
That's where of the two pockets, it's the larger pocket, and the smaller pocket would be potentially even more dense than that, maybe including some townhouses as well.
So these are 2-acre lots now. So you mean someone
Yes.
with a 2-acre could build 8 homes on? So
Well, no, this is only the undeveloped portion. So these lands are not developed now. The remaining portion would remain as required a minimum 2-acre lots. So the part that's already developed for estate residential, so the majority of Toronto Gore, that we're not proposing to change. We're just proposing policy options to make sure that when you come in to build a new house, you meet certain character requirements to maintain that character.
And if someone wants to build like a mall in between, they're allowed, or just homes?
It would just be residential, not commercial.
Is that because of the 2-acre lots?
No, it would just be because that's the kind of the policy regime of the official plan. Your question was relating to commercial development? Or?
Commercial.
Yeah, so right now commercial uses are not permitted on any of these lands.
Even along, through the chair, even along Gore?
Even along Gore.
But
I believe there is some commercial development envisioned or planned for the secondary plan, the Block 47 lands on the east side of the Gore.
Yeah, that, all right, I know. But south of Castlemore on Gore, just south of it, 1 block, we're allowed commercial.
South of Castlemore, I don't
There's
have
estate homes there too. Upscale executive homes there too, and we allowed it.
I believe
the
they
main
would
road.
have to be designated commercial, but that wasn't something that we're looking at right now. Just looking at maintaining residential.
Well, so last year, we approved something there, a daycare, and it's right there at State Homes where they're 2-acre, some of them are 3-acre lots on Gore.
Oh, yes.
And it's only a difference of 100 feet.
I believe.
So what
yeah,
makes
I
that
believe-
side different from this side? That's what, it's on the main road.
I mean, those lots are accessed directly off of the Gore, whereas inside the Toronto Gore, the majority of homes are accessed from internal streets.
I'm asking on Gore. Are they
On
allowed?
Gore?
Yeah. It's a main road.
That's a main road, but the lots, the existing community that's off of the Gore are all accessed off of roads from the Gore. That one pocket though, where we have it colored yellow, I guess, that one, I mean, right now the policy option being put forward is just for residential, but we could look to see whether there's any benefit
I
in
think
having
we're
some
gonna-
of that be commercial as well.
My question is, I understand on these sides all commercial. On the west side,
Yep.
along Gore, if any lots face Gore Road,
Yes.
1 acre, 2 acre, are they allowed commercial?
They're not allowed commercial.
So on the south side they are though. Of
On
Castlemore.
on the south side
And
of
their state homes
Castlemore,
are bigger lots there than the north.
I wouldn't know specifically the detail. If there was a site-specific amendment for that property, I'm not sure.
So I think, Councillor Fortini, maybe city staff.
Okay, just because it's only 1 block south or north, it's a main road, I figured. If they could do there all along the main road, if we're gonna develop it, I don't see on the main road why you can't have it.
And you,
Not
sorry,
inside.
just for clarification, you mean, I believe you were saying south of Castlemore, but I think you're referring to south of Countryside, is
No,
that right?
Gore Road, Fitzpatrick. We
Fitzpatrick.
allowed there facing there, we're allowed there, and there are 3 acres, they're bigger lots than up here. We allowed commercial daycare or wherever that's right there, because it's a
I'm
main
gonna
road.
let Councillor Fortini, I'm gonna let the city staff weigh in.
Through the chair, actually, what we're doing right now is negotiating with what's known as the Area 47, which is directly to the east of these lands. And within that land area, there's actually a district retail commercial and other commercial uses that we're working on right now for that planned community just to the east.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Palashi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering what public consultation looks like for this. Is it typical under the Planning Act, or do we broaden this and make it citywide? Because really, what we're talking about are numbers that have to do with citywide.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps the city could speak to
Okay,
the
it's in
notice
your report
requirement.
as public consultation, but I
Right.
wasn't sure if you're making suggestions or
I personally, I'm open to anyone being invited. I'm
Sure.
happy to do that.
Okay.
We'll let the city.
Through the chair. As staff, we're going to take direction of today's meeting, but then we'll put our minds together and figure out what that community engagement looks like.
Okay, so might I suggest that we look at the potential for having this public engagement citywide?
Through the chair, if that's the will of council, we'll take that direction.
I don't want to direct without you actually coming back to let me know what we were kind of thinking about and what you're suggesting. So I don't want to direct you in any way right now. I'd like to see what that potential looks like when we're dealing with numbers that affect the city across.
I'm not turning on here. Through the chair. I'm certainly getting the sense that there's an interest to broaden this in a reasonable way. So what we will do is we will take that into account as we put together our plans on community engagement and make sure that it's outside of the normal statutory public meeting process.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Santos?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation. I just, if we could go to slide number 7, showing kind of the town center of the area.
Mm-hmm.
I've zoomed into here, so the area of Brand East, Gore Road, and Castlemore.
Yes.
If we look at that vision and then we go to slide 18, where the density is happening in that small parcel, I'm just slightly concerned that it contradicts what that town center is supposed to be. And I worry that if we rezone it accordingly now, that we are actually moving away from what that town center is supposed to be. Because right now, I believe that whole area is all houses already to the south on Castlemore and Gore. Is that correct? So if there's no room for commercial or mixed use, and if it ends up being just moderate density, that town center on slide 7 may not be in the future. So I'm just worried about the precedents we're setting.
Thank you. Do staff want to make a comment?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The Area 47 land, that land that we're going through the planning process on right now, it has been appealed to the board, but we are negotiating with the landowner about how to formulate that town center and see it evolve over time. So we're working on that concept is what I'd leave you with.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Singh?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. First, I got to ask Councillor Palashi, why are we looking at doing this citywide, the consultation? What was the rationale for that? Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm just waiting for my mic.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much. I guess, so when we're dealing with issues like this, and we'll deal with it over time, where we're, it's kind of a numbers game, where, you know, throughout the city we take these numbers from the region, and we look to in where to allocate these numbers. And not being specific to this site, but specifically to sites across the city of Brampton, it's affecting other areas with the ratios and finding that right balance. And when we're dealing with this area, or we're dealing with, you know, we really have the last two frontiers,
Yeah.
the northeast and the northwest.
Yeah.
So we have to look at, you know, all aspects of where we're putting the numbers and what they look like. And, you know, we just got out of a workshop about being inclusive and,
Yeah.
and what that looks like. And we need, I think, we need comments from across the city to indicate how we're planning and where our growth is going.
So what I'm hearing is you're talking about overall consultation on future development residential. You're not just specifically focusing on this.
Not at all.
Yeah,
It's not
okay.
specific to
That's-
this, but it's specific to this in
How it
ways that
impacts others,
specific to all other
Yeah, yeah.
areas.
Yeah,
that
so
come
you're looking
together,
more
right?
at a higher level, is
Sure,
what I'm
yeah.
understanding. Okay. Okay, that's fine. And secondly, my question is regarding the necessary infrastructure to support more density. So at what point do we start engaging schools and yeah, and faith-based organized. This is, I was looking at data with the Brampton Springdale Network, and 86% of the communities in wards 9 and 10 attends faith-based organizations. So, sorry, faith-based institutions. So, how are we going to incorporate all of that? What are we looking at? Yeah.
So through the chair, maybe I can answer your first question, or just your first question about the consultation. If we are to reach out on the broader sense around the community, it would be in the context of this application.
Okay,
And,
good.
you know, what the sentiment is about changing densities here. And we'd figure out what that looks like, whether it's town hall or something like that. We'd sort that out. To your second question, as we get direction to move forward, we would engage all of these stakeholders, including school boards and local community stakeholders, to offer us feedback on the planning instruments that we would need to put in place moving forward, in which case we would roll that into a recommendation report that would be brought back to council here.
Okay. And just, I guess for the record, and maybe you could clarify, I do not feel that there's one school in this area. Am I correct on that?
There is within the actual Toronto Gore
Yeah, and
community,
within.
there boundaries. I don't believe that there is.
There
There's
is.
St. Patrick's School
Yeah, which is just for the
south
record,
of
a
Mayfield,
Catholic-
but on the west side.
Yeah,
so
which is also
technically,
a Catholic
yeah.
school board. And on Mayfield, that area is ready for a school, been waiting for a school, and they haven't even released the funds yet. And so we have to be mindful that our schools around are exceeding their enrollment numbers as of now. So just for the record, we could keep that in mind. We really have to look at the schools. Just for the record, there's not one school in this area yet. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, Chair. In looking at this, I fully recognize that the majority of this area of Brampton is already very much in the advanced stages of its planning and the thinking around what it is that this area wants to be. When we look at the Vision 2040 document and we talk about building town centers, and there's 5 of them scattered around the city, and then I look at the wording in this report with regards to moderately higher density, upscale executive residential, and you talk about how in this area here you have 600 units presently, and then you're going to densify a bit by adding 600 units here. When we talk about moderately higher density, that is still very, very far away from what the Vision 2040 document talks about with respect to a town center. We've built an incredible recreation center in this area, and essentially it's being slowly over time as we go through each project, it's being surrounded by what in my opinion is very low density development, extremely low density. And I wonder what it is that we really see for this area, because if it's the desire of the local area councillors to continue to see this area developed in this way, that's fine, that is what they want. And if that's what the residents in this area would like to see, I support that as well. But let's not kid ourselves here that when we say moderately higher density, it's still very low density. And you're not going to have anything that even resembles a town center in this area if you continue to build and develop the city in this way. Now, this area is relatively small, and there are other parcels around it that are still waiting to be built out, but we need to be honest that we're kind of missing the point of the Vision 2040 document when we're talking in these terms for this property and others. And so I think that as we go forward, consult with the public and continue to speak with the stakeholders who are looking to develop these lands. You mentioned that other area that is already in far more advanced stages of planning. They have a commercial zone, that's great, but we're still very far away from the idea of a town center being located in this part of the city. So those are just my comments, and welcome anyone else's. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think that's essentially what Councillor Leshy talked about the public meeting, is really how do you balance identifying that characteristic which reflects the community now, which is upscale executive, and how do we also meet some of the challenges that have been identified in that in our Vision 2040. Councillor Willens.
Yes, through you, Chair. Just quickly, one of the slides about the open space analysis, you mentioned down there, if there's an increased density supported by council, it's recommended that a future secondary plan address future parkland needs. I'm assuming that's, when you say neighborhood park, I'm assuming that you'd be a smaller community-based park, because I wouldn't see the need for a larger park in this area with that small area with Gore Meadows being so close.
That's correct. It would be more of those local and neighborhood-sized parks within, just to serve, you know, an established walking radius within the portion of the undeveloped lands.
Okay.
But the function of that would be to serve that community specifically.
Okay. And getting along the lines of what Councillor Vicente said, it really isn't that much density there, and you've got that beautiful rec center out there that people are starving for transportation, but we start doing low density, you can forget about transportation in that area. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Willens. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Great presentation, and it does leave a lot for us to consider. And I think Willens and Councillor Willens and Councillor Vicente touched on the transit piece, and that's where I'm going with this. Have we taken into consideration where the main transportation hub is going to be on Highway 50, and knowing that we do need to move towards a very more dense housing kind of hub here. So I'm just wondering how we're incorporating that very important aspect around the transit hub, Highway 50. We want to encourage more people to move into this area, and are we really going to be doing that with the type of homes that we're looking at, the executive, moderate density, so on and so forth?
I think, so I wouldn't be able to comment specifically on the Highway 50, perhaps staff could, transit hub. But I know that as part of the infrastructure analysis, the analysis was really looking at how the existing transit system could accommodate that additional, and given the existing bus service that exists, that could accommodate the level of transit that would be required. Now, if there were much higher urban densities, then I think through a more detailed secondary planning process, there would have to be a much more detailed analysis for transit, certainly. And I'm hearing the comments about looking at, you know, I'll discuss with city as well, but, you know, those higher densities, certainly that would change transit service in the area.
Okay, because it would concern me to make decisions based on what we have now, because that is not, I don't think, what anybody in council here is really looking at. We really want to look towards that future development, and knowing that Highway 50 is such a large artery, and it's quite close to this area, how can we leverage that and to encourage more people to want to move into an area that is supposed to be a hub for that, you know, end of the city.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Dillon.
Can I have some, sorry, to the chair. I have some questions in regards to this that perhaps may be in camera. So I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to get advice from legal and the clerk right now.
Would you like to recess for 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Can you?
So folks, it's 1:39. We come back at 1:45. On to the next item. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I believe Councillor Dillon was on the board. Councillor Dillon? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just after discussion with staff, we feel it might be best to bring it back at a future planning meeting to have a more thorough discussion.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Dillon,
In
for
camera.
that explanation. So if there's no further questions or comments, okay, so I need a mover to receive the presentation. Moved by Councillor Bowman. All in favor? Carried. And I think at this time we'll bring up staff report 7.1. Are there any questions or comments regarding this report? No. Moved by Councillor Singh. All in favor? Carried. Thank you very much, and thank you. Our next item of business is our delegation regarding 6.1, a presentation from Daniela Balasal regarding Housing Brampton Seniors Housing Study. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of Planning Committee. My name is Daniela Balasal, a policy planner in Planning and Development Services. Today I will be presenting on Brampton's Seniors Housing Study, along with the study's findings and recommendations. In terms of background, staff received direction from Council to undertake an assessment to identify ideal sites within the city's built-up area or within our built boundary, having close proximity to services and amenities that would support or be suitable for seniors' housing facilities. A comprehensive study has now been completed, and this supports the notion of aging in place, and it also supports the direction of provincial policy that the city provides for a range of housing options. The study is a deliverable of the city's affordable housing strategy. However, it does not deal with affordability, but rather the identification of those suitable sites per Council's direction and endorsement of a work plan, a project work plan. The study has resulted in a better understanding of what facilities currently exist in Brampton for seniors housing, as well as the location of prospective sites throughout the city. Though Brampton has a very young population, 20% of the city's population are older, Though Brampton has a young population, 20% of the city's population are older adults, so those who are 55 years and up. Brampton seniors cohort continues to be one of the fastest growing segments of the population in the city. For the study's intent and purposes, seniors housing includes facilities such as retirement homes, nursing homes, adult lifestyle communities such as what we find in Rosedale Village, as well as shared housing arrangements. However, the development of long-term care facilities has not been assessed as part of this review, given that such uses are institutional in nature and they are regulated by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. In terms of current context, across the GTA, monthly rents for seniors average about $4,000 for retirement homes. And we are well aware that affordability is quite an issue for seniors, particularly those who are newer immigrants or who live alone. Seniors are often on fixed incomes and are choosing to work post-retirement more often. Seniors also have varying levels of mobility with increasing dependence on in-home care services as they age. As well, based on benchmarking, most seniors' developments do include on-site amenities or tend to be within walking distance to essential services in order to support daily living needs of its residents. Various community stakeholders were consulted to help guide the study's development, including Brampton's Emergency Management Office, the Region of Peel, Community and Mortgage, Canada and Mortgage Housing Corporation, Indus, Punjabi Community Health Services, as well as the faith community. Through engagement efforts, community agencies identified the importance of 3 key themes necessary for improving the quality of lives of seniors, of local seniors. For one, community partnerships, such as collaboration between the not-for-profit sector, places of worship, and the private sector. And this relates to community and social hubs, which is a second theme, followed by affordability. So recognizing the importance or the challenges that seniors tend to face. This particular slide shows information from one of the several case studies that were examined as part of the study's benchmarking work. On the left is is a Google image of Chartwell Retirement Residence in Vaughan. And then the map on the right shows that the facility is near a neighborhood park. However, it is not within walking distance to a bus stop. So this site is not accessible, not only for its residents, but also visitors and employees alike. A methodology was developed to guide the study site selection process, and this resulted in the identification of an evaluation criteria that was applied to prospective sites. And this includes limiting sites to a 0.5 radius to district retail uses throughout the city, and this represents a 5 to 10 minute walking distance. As well, a 1.5 kilometer radius was applied to regional retail sites, and this represents a 20-minute walk. And those type of uses include Trinity Commons and Bramley City Centre. Other criteria that was applied includes identifying minimum size requirements, looking at land use compatibility considerations, as well as environmental and development constraints or servicing constraints, as well as walkability and access to transit and essential services and amenities. And this methodology that was applied within the study is loosely based on a site selection process that was contained within a CMHC report entitled Housing for Older Canadians. And this also indicates consideration for the aforementioned selection criteria. A composite map was developed which identifies existing seniors housing facilities within Brampton, along with the 0.5 and the 1.5 radius around district and regional retail sites, respectively. A full-size copy of this map was provided to members of committee, and it relates to item 7.2-90 in the agenda package. Retail sites and adjacent land uses were identified as being areas in the city that could accommodate seniors' housing facilities, and these were considered ideal because they are naturally occurring commercial and service housed at a neighborhood and retail level, so integrated into existing communities. As shown on the composite map contained within the report, currently there are 23 existing seniors facilities within Brampton. A total of 15 sites were identified through the site selection process, and 11 of those sites were identified within the 0.5 district retail, within the 0.5 radius of district retail uses. So again, at the neighborhood or neighborhood or community level, while 4 adjacent sites were identified as being within a 1.5 radius to regional retail uses. So that would be Shoppers World. So this slide and the next shows images of all of the 15 potential or prospective development sites that were identified. As is noted, all of the sites are vacant, and most of them are privately owned. Toward the bottom of the slide, the center photo shows the 4 adjacent properties that fall within the radius of a regional retail use, so again, Shoppers World. Okay. And then this is the second slide of the 15 sites in Brampton. The analysis undertaken in support of the study resulted in the following recommendations. The first, giving recognition to the need for affordable and culturally sensitive seniors' homes within Brampton. The second, an examination of incentives that could promote the development of seniors' housing developments, and this should be undertaken as part of the city's affordable housing strategy. The third, future development applications and the fact that they could be assessed against the study's evaluation criteria. So looking at things such as land use compatibility, servicing constraints, and walkability, as I previously mentioned. As well, number 4, official plan policies and the fact that those can be strengthened to provide for a range of housing types and tenure. And this is also in keeping with provincial policy, the need for the city to provide for a range of housing types, as well as consideration to pre-zoning the identified sites that satisfy the criteria. And finally, advocacy around the creation of local partnerships to support the needs of seniors. And ideally looking at housing. So for instance, multi-generational housing options, as well as co-ops for seniors to address social isolation issues, which are often experienced by older adults as they become empty nesters. And this is often coupled with increasing health challenges as one ages. And this, of course, aligns with the work that the city is doing on its age-friendly strategy. At this time, staff is seeking council's endorsement of the seniors housing study, followed by engagement on the study's findings and recommendations, so consulting with our the city's housing advisory committee, and then refinement of the list of the prospective sites if necessary. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bowman.
Thank you very much, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the report. Well done, and we've been talking about it for quite a while. I just have a couple of questions here. The 6 of the 10 suggested locations are in Ward 3-4. We had a workshop this morning where we talked about making sure that all areas of the city have all the required facilities that they're going to require in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. In talking to some of my colleagues, there's areas where they've got that, you know, a lot of people may be retiring in an area, for instance, Heart Lake, for example, where the residents there would love to have a seniors facility within an area of Heart Lake where they know the neighbors, they know the area, but I don't know if that was considered when we did this. Secondly, and this is more for you, Rob. Have we incorporated what we know about the RioCan development into this report? Because we basically heard about it just a couple of weeks ago, and I imagine this report's been ongoing for several weeks now. So I'll let you answer that. But I've just got, and the transit corridors. You know, we've got Steeles, we've got Kennedy Road, which could be a transit corridor, Dixie Road, Beauverde, especially Queen Street. But on Queen Street, I don't really see any of these potential areas once you get past Bramley Road, which are going to be heavily developed within a matter of years. So, you know, I'm just a little concerned that we're going to be looking to put all these things into a single location or a single ward, when we really should be looking at the entire rest of the city for this stuff.
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, there's a couple of questions there that I'll try to tackle in some order. First off, the purpose of this study is really to look at developable parcels. We didn't really look at opportunities for redevelopment, and that could very well take a life of its own as private interests changed and the ages of buildings might necessitate a redevelopment. So that would have been a scope that was a little bit beyond what we were able to handle. So that's definitely subject to the interests of those landowners now, and they can come forward. I also want to make it really clear that we aren't actually able to zone or designate lands based on the age of somebody. What we've tried to do here is identify what we thought were opportunities where somebody could come along and say, I want to build a seniors facility. This is an ideal location based on these criteria. So Shoppers World, as it is itself, is a major key to what makes these areas viable in terms of an attraction. Being within a certain walkable distance to something like district retail like Shoppers World is certainly of bonus. And as RioCan looks at the future, we think that it'll continue to be a hub of activity for people through various ways. Whether or not it's something RioCan is interested in doing on their site, we haven't had that conversation specifically. We're not at that point where we're talking about the built form just yet with RioCan.
Okay, thank you. And the transit corridors, they're an important aspect of this. And I think, you know, if we're going to look at putting these facilities where people can easily get on transit, the main transit corridors have got to be in this consideration.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's absolutely important. We recognize that maintaining one's mobility is important for people as they age. And we recognize that we're not trying to build, or we haven't identified a built form that would just cater to one person or one ability or mobility. It's that broad range of mobility and accessibility that people have in their senior years. So we wanted to make it open, but recognizing that mobility is still important to people as they age, whether they're driving a car or walking or taking a transit. So that is an important element of our decision here.
Okay, thank you.
Our findings, rather.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Bowman. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I think this is exciting and moving in the direction where we do need to make sure we are taking care of our senior aging population. I'm just wondering, you know, I see that the slide about the 2016, it says 20% of our population for 2016. What will that translate in future numbers when it comes to, like, when we're actually looking at making this into a viable possibility? What are we looking at for the amount of seniors that may access or need these homes? Do we have that projection, that numbers?
Through the chair, one of the undertakings that the planning department is embarking on right now is a complete review of our official plan, and that's very much based on all the demographics that are available, and we look out in the future and figure out what makes sense in terms of that compatibility. So this is really just a subset of the affordable housing strategy, and the goal and the direction to staff from council at the time was to look at some immediate opportunities that made sense from a seniors housing opportunity. This is not to restrict it or to limit it in any way, but it's just to really assist people to say that's a good opportunity in this particular neighborhood.
Okay. All right, cool. And I'm just wondering, well, I know Shay is a growing organization in Peel that does supportive housing, and they're really taking on a mental health focused perspective, but they have quite a depth of information on what might be helpful, especially if we're looking at mental health needs for our aging communities. So how to plan homes and environments that will be the most accommodating and supportive for these future developments. So they're saying, I know it says building relationships with other organizations, so Shay may be a good one to contact and talk. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Palashi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Rob, just going back on your comment about us looking at developable property and not so much the redevelopment. What does that mean kind of long term? Once we've gone through the consultation and put this in form of policy, does a developer come if they want to build something in the city of Brampton that's within these footprints that we've kind of highlighted? Do they have an easier access in doing what they would like, in what we would like them to achieve than somebody else that was building or possibly redeveloping in outside of these zones that were highlighted?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's actually a fantastic question. And the short answer is that this will help us shape our planning policies for these key areas. If somebody else was to come along with a project that was a redevelopment opportunity but yet made a lot of sense, we would certainly look at that. Really what we're trying to identify here is the built form, whether it's the density, the proximity to these things that Daniel spoke about. But if somebody came along and made this proposal from a planning perspective, there's no reason why we couldn't find a way through to supporting that. Does this result in an expedited process for somebody who's on these lands? Not as of today. Depending on the designations that rest with the land, they'd still have to go through those planning approval processes.
Just like anybody else. So it's not the expedited, because what we're talking, we're always talking dollar figures with the developer that wants to bring something that we want in the city of Brampton. And length of time adds more dollar figures to that. So if somebody was, regardless if it was development or redevelopment, if somebody was bringing something that was in this highlighted area as opposed to somebody that, was outside of the areas that we've highlighted, it's going to be the same process, right? Dollar
through the chair. Again, we'd have to look at what the OP and the secondary plan designations were on those specific parcels. I think the fastest route would likely be it wouldn't have to go through those processes, because as we go through the update to our official plan and other planning instruments, we would be able to bring those online, certain densities and things like that. Again, we're not going to identify areas and say that that's geared towards the seniors housing, but we know that it would be an ideal location. However, the underlying designations would allow for certain densities and things like that. So if somebody brought through an application, hopefully that could be a fairly expedited process. Maybe it needs a rezoning, maybe even just site plan, if we could put those in place, if we got direction to do so here.
So I guess in going back to Councillor Bowman's kind of example, and we've talked about it before, where there's people in Heart Lake that would like to cash in on their investment. Their house is too much for them, but they still want to maintain and live in Heart Lake. There's nowhere for them to go. So if there was an opportunity to come forward, I guess this to me is kind of setting the precedent of putting a possibility of more layers on that process.
So through the chair, not necessarily. If somebody had lands that just hadn't been identified through this exercise, again, there could be lands that were up for redevelopment or for some other reason they felt it made sense. They would be able to apply through the planning process. A proper evaluation, a recommendation could be brought forward to council for consideration at that point.
Currently, the way we do it now.
Yes, correct.
But if it's outside of that highlighted area, we're actually taking that area and we're trying to simplify, which for good reason and good understanding. But going back to the example that was given, there's other areas in the city of Brampton that people want to stay and maintain and live, and they're not highlighted on the maps. You know, in one of the slides, it shows not the lowest, but the kind of the second lowest to seniors living, or seniors in that area, and I know that really there's nobody that lives in that area. It's one or two houses. Or if you look at the high purple areas, the dark where it shows a lot of, well, that's because in one section of that, there is a seniors living building or something. So it kind of, I know that we're working on the information that we've been provided, and that's all we can do. And the sections and the squares and the boxes that we have before us, those are the sections and the squares and the boxes, and it's hard for us to, you know, break those down even further, and I understand that.
Through the chair, if I may, I want to make it clear that we're not prescribing that seniors housing isn't appropriate in other areas of the city. We looked at a criteria that said, based on even CMHC's own approach to what makes sense and what seniors are looking for, we really tried to hone in on, well, what's available today, meeting those criteria. If somebody else came through and said, you've missed a spot or there's something else, that just does not preclude that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Plushy. Councillor Singh.
Sure. So I'm not kind of understanding, I guess. So I see, for example, 410 and Bovaird highlighted as a potential site, which is Trinity Commons. I don't get where the sites are there that we're looking at. Like, where are we talking about? Where's the land that we're referring to as a potential site for seniors on the map? Or even the hospital. I guess I'm just not understanding what we're referring to there as potential sites. Like, how is that a potential site?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the sites, the potential sites, the 15 potential sites are identified in purple. So the radius that you, the various radii that you see on the map is just reflective of the retail sites, and then if based on our methodology, which we applied citywide, if there were potential vacant properties, those would have been identified and shown in the purple.
So are we talking about converting retail sites?
Well, looking at that, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, looking at those sites as having potential because they often serve a commercial and service use at the neighborhood and commercial uses. So that was the approach to identifying the 15 sites.
So kind of like, I guess, Bremley City Center, how they have across, in the same mall, they have the seniors home. Are we referring to sort of that kind of potential development? Something like that, like because I don't see land there. I know that area very well. There's no land for us to.
Yes. So sorry. There's no site. Yes, there are no sites there because there weren't any vacant residential sites, and the retail sites were identified within the official plan. So Schedule A2 of the official plan.
Okay.
That show the retail uses within the city, the hierarchy of retail uses throughout the city.
Okay. And so are we suggesting one of those uses might be a senior's home with this? Oh, sorry, senior's facility.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, only if it was a residential site, so that was a part of the criteria.
Okay.
So we didn't identify any employment or institutional sites, only vacant residential sites throughout the city.
Okay. Okay. And secondly, how are we going to communicate this out? So if somebody wants to have more information, are we going to put this on a website? For potential senior, like, is there a goal, is there a communication strategy for this? Because I get asked all the time, is there potential for seniors home in wards 9 and 10 specifically. So there's a link I could send them to, or?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So the approach has just been to go back to take this information to our advisory committee, our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, and we have communicated it to those who've shown interest in the information, directing them to the agenda package.
Okay. So maybe after the advisory committee portion is done, we could just put it on the website, maybe even the map or something. It might just be helpful. As a counselor, that would be very helpful to me anyways, specifically.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Singh. Councillor Fortini.
Thank you, through the chair. Just a couple of questions. Thank you for the report. I don't see some other senior homes here for long-term and nursing homes. We're missing Leisure World. We have 3 of them here in Brampton. We're missing, there's another one I can't remember. Is that part of it?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we did not identify institutional uses or long-term care facilities, given the nature of those uses. They are regulated by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care Facilities, so we found that those were, because they're institutional in nature, it was outside of the scope of this review. So we only identified retirement homes and similar housing options for seniors.
So probably like the Holiday Inn that turned into a retirement, and Bramley City Center is not part of that. Right.
Yes. So through you, Mr. Chair, Bramley City Center, the Bramley retirement residence should be reflected in this map.
One thing is, I don't know how to put this. So we look at Dayspring. Someone requested a senior home across the street and said it was too far from a hospital. Meanwhile, we're showing Dayspring there. Just down the street is Leisure World. But, you know, I look around, like, go to these senior homes, and I did a lot of maintenance. It's not only about what is, you gotta look at the culture too. So you go to Toronto, you got the Recreation retirement home, you got the Columbus Center for the Italians, you got each one has their own. Because a lot of, if I find, you go to one place and you don't know, the culture is different, the food is different, the communication is different, and to have a senior put in somewhere where you cannot communicate, you can't socialize, I don't, you know, I find it would be pretty hard. It's like someone going to a different country. So do we look at those studies too when we look at these?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we did look, so the study does identify the need for culturally sensitive retirement homes. So we know as one ages, they often tend to revert back to their mother tongue. So the study recognizes that. There was some benchmarking undertaken as part of the study that looked at 4 different municipalities and the retirement homes found in those communities, and the direction of the study was to look at how services and supports are needed to support the daily living needs of seniors in those areas, in those communities.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fortini. So if there's no further questions or comments, can I get a mover to accept the presentation? Councillor Williams, all in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. As we move on, members of council, as you know, item 7.3 is in consent motion. Minutes also have been moved to consent. Referred matters, there are no referred matters. And I believe, so item 13.1 is the added correspondence. If I can get someone to move receipt, Councillor Singh, all in favor? Carried. And now we're at Councillor question period. Are there any members of the council? Councillor Fortini, you have a question?
Quickly, through the chair. Well, last time we talked, we said we're looking at our bylaws, changing our density. Do you know when that's coming? When it's all going to be done?
Sorry, through the chair, perhaps Councillor Fadidi could give me a little bit more clarity. Densities across the city or in a specific
downtown,
area?
if we want to develop the downtown, like Mississauga has unlimited height. Vaughan just changed it. If we want to do it and bring the parking ratio from 0.9 to 0.5 and let them market their own parking spots, we're changing that? You said, I think we're there, you know?
So through the chair, there's a number of things. We are now embarking on our official plan review or rewrite, as we might call it. That'll look at, certain densities and things like that. There's a zoning update happening right now as well, where we're gonna get some recommendations around things like parking. There's not a bylaw per se coming forward that's gonna talk about parking on its own, but what we are open to is looking at alternative development standards, which doesn't need a bylaw. We would do that as development applications come in. If it's justified through certain traffic studies and parking studies, staff have been quite open recently to looking at alternatives to our standards.
And we're looking at the height density across the city?
Through the chair, again,
More
that
height.
would be part of our comprehensive policy review.
Less than 26. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Puccini. No further questions, so my apologies, members of council, in my, I guess, eagerness to move forward. We have to go back and receive the report 7.2, the recommendations regarding housing, Brampton Seniors Housing Study. So moved by Councillor Bowman. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. So there are no further questions. I believe we move on to public question period. Are there members of the public like to come forward and ask any questions? Going once, twice. Thank you very much. Last item of business is adjournment. Next committee meeting is February 11th at 7 p.m. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Fortini, all in favor? Carried. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the afternoon.